or new media is omnipresent in our lives, transforming the way we communicate and share information. Politically, its impact has been profound, acting as a catalyst for swaying public opinion on a global scale. With us today is Catie Bailard, Assistant Professor of Media and Public Affairs. Catie is an expert on the intersection of politics and digital media, and she's the author of the new book, Democracy's Double-Edged Sword: How Internet Use Changes Citizens' Views of Their Government. Catie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Catie, your first book really allows us and talks about for ordinary citizens to have the chance to use digital media as a means to understand how governments function. I was wondering, what is the effect of having all of that information at one's fingertips?
Well, that's actually my answer. I mean, the real impact of the internet is just the degree to which it's changed the volume of information, the range of information that's available for public consumption. And the importance of this is that it's creating a more kind of globally consistent metric with which to evaluate our own government's performance. So taken together, this has a lot of practical implications for the set of information we use to evaluate our government and the satisfaction that is derived from those evaluations.
I mean, this is really interesting, and one of the things I'd like to just push you a little bit further on is the extent to which other consumers, international consumers, digest this information about our government. And also on a related note, what about the demographics? Is a different age category now being more exposed to the functioning of government than perhaps we've seen?
I would argue yes. I mean, I think there's definitely a byproduct effect. I think we've seen byproduct effects in media use for a long time. Turning to television for entertainment and then accidentally be exposed to political information. This is happening a lot more. This is happening on people's social media feeds. There are a lot of internet uses that are exposing kind of a broader range and a different demographic set of individuals to political information that they may not have been as likely to be exposed to. In terms of the effect of citizens in other nations being exposed to our government, and I would argue other advanced democracies, and maybe some that are functioning a little better than our own at the moment. So how satisfied you are with how democracy functions in your country depends on how you conceptualize democracy. In the past, our governments had a lot of latitude in defining democracy for their citizens. Therefore, they could somewhat influence citizen evaluation of their performance. And what the internet does is it reduces these other governments' latitude in defining democracy for their citizens. We now have this more globally consistent metric of what democratic governance looks like. And I think that has a significant impact on the criteria that people now use to evaluate their own government's performance.
Reaching back into history, one of the interesting things that we know is how printmaking and how the mass production of print media arguably brought the world closer together, arguably made information more readily available, and really created a more united, in some ways, world, some would argue. Is digital media different? Does it over-individualize, or is it in some ways related to that initial experiment that became print journalism?
You know, I think it goes both ways. And with the title of my book, Democracy's Double-Edged Sword, my view of technology's effect is that it tends to be dual-natured because it is an amplifier of human intention. So to some degree, there is this individualization, this kind of fragmentation, right, and kind of hyper-focusing on, consuming the content you want. But I mean, we actually find a lot of the research is showing that internet users are actually exposed to a broader set of political views than at least they are in their day-to-day face interactions, and then often through the traditional media that they consume. And so I think it goes both ways. I mean, yes, you have the elements of it where you can very much personalize now your news consumption, but I do think there is still at the same time a kind of a broadening of perspective, a broadening of experience, even if it's incidental. I do subscribe to the notion a bit of the increasing tendency to see yourself as a citizen of the world or of the globe, and I do think this very global technology that we have now, I mean, because the internet is global in ways that broadcast media could never be, is really contributing, I do think, to that development of that identity.
In what ways does digital media actually empower individuals?
I do very much subscribe to the traditional notion that information is power, or at least information is the foundation of power. And so in that sense, I think that the internet does provide opportunities for empowerment that were less likely to exist before. For example, in many of these countries, elites and government officials have long controlled communication capacity. They've had near monopolies over the ability to send information over geographic spaces. Broadcast media is very easy to control. It's a single point to multi-point technology. So information radiates or is disseminated from a single point to the masses. So it's obviously pretty easy to control the information that's being sent through traditional broadcast media. Also in many of these countries, up until a decade ago with the expansion of mobile phones, a lot of average citizens didn't even have have access to telephonic communication. So what new technologies have really done is really decentralize communication capacity. And I believe that, in a world where this capacity is decentralized, there are many more opportunities for empowerment than you would see in a world where elites continue to control have the type of monopoly they had long enjoyed. But by no means is empowerment automatic. By no means is it guaranteed. There's still other contextual factors that need to be present, not to mention actors who have to choose to use that technology towards a certain end.
Do you think that we're living through right now a new moment in the history of democracy, given what's happening with the digital media revolution? Do you also think that at some point, as people become empowered, governments will step ahead of the curve so that there will be new forms of control that will be devised? What do you see in the future?
Well, in terms of the governments, yes. Already, right, we're seeing, three things come to mind immediately. There's the cyber warfare that government and government supporters are participating in. So the Syrian electronic army comes to mind. Since the beginning of the Syrian uprising, hackers have been very active on both sides. Opposition supporters have hacked into government websites, used the internet to document government abuses. But then there's the Syrian electronic army, which is a pro-Assad group of hackers who have hacked into opposition websites, attacked opposition websites, posted names and addresses against of the opposition supporters, threatened opposition supporters, and successfully hacked into a number of mainstream media websites and also the U.S. Marine Corps' website. So that's clearly an important tool that's available to governments. There's also flooding the internet, using the internet to spread pro-government propaganda. So the country that comes to mind here is Russia. A lot of the internet infrastructure in Russia is controlled or owned by Kremlin-friendly or government-controlled oligarchs and companies. And so they can pretty effectively use the internet to just send out pro-Kremlin messages. And hopefully their hope is to drown out critical content online. And then, of course, there's censorship, right? And so the country that comes to mind here is China. Very successful, relatively speaking, successful regulatory system, pretty sophisticated. But I would argue that even in these countries, even in countries with the most successful internet regulatory systems, there's just a multitude of examples of critical content that is slipping through the cracks. And I would actually argue that, yes, individuals living in these countries are receiving less critical information and less information than citizens living in nations where internet is totally free and unregulated. However, these nations tend to be pretty information scarce. So even the fraction of critical content that slips through the cracks, this marginal increase in critical information, I believe can have a very significant political impact in these countries. So I think it is, it's definitely changing the kind of, I call it informational relationship shared by governments and their citizens. And this is true for democratic countries, but it's also true for democratizing authoritarian nations.
That's remarkable. Thank you, Catie, for being with us and sharing your information and insights into this critical topic that is going to be with us for quite a long time.
Thank you for having me. I had a lot of fun. It was great to be here.
Thanks.